مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير
And welcome to the Islamic Dawah Movement's short video, and I hope beneficial to you, of course, on mental health. This video is part of the Islamic Dawah Movement's Islamic Awareness Month of activities, which, yes folks, it is October 2017. I'm your host, Aliyah Abdullah, and we will be discussing anxiety and depression. We invite you to listen and follow, and we do hope you are more informed at the end of this presentation. This is a very big and taboo topic, but it is so common right now, we have to shed light on this. Approximately 1 in 5 adults in the US experiences mental illness in a given year, according to the National Institute on Mental Health. In the UK, it is 1 in 4. While we don't have the full statistics for Trinidad and Tobago, we do know it is more common than the average person would think. For today, we are joined in the studio by Ms. Vandana Susanka Ali. Ms. Vandana Susanka Ali is a clinical psychologist who works in the field of child protection. She also has experience on various issues, namely parenting, self-psychology, and relationships. She's an avid community worker who coordinates several social and cultural empowerment projects in the community where she resides. Welcome, Vandana, and thank you for joining us here today.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for having me.
Tell me, what is depression?
Depression is a very serious mental and medical illness which affects thousands, hundreds of persons all over the world. And it's an illness that affects the way you think, act, and feel. The symptoms range from mild to severe, and there's several symptoms that you can look out for to know whether or not you have depression. Those symptoms include having depressed mood for more days than not, losing interest or pleasure in things that you would usually enjoy, noticing a change in your sleeping pattern. So that means that you can either be sleeping more often, more hours, or less hours than usual, having difficulty with falling asleep, so we know it as insomnia, or there's hypersomnia as well, too much sleep. There's also changes in your eating patterns. So persons feel that they have an increased appetite or a loss of appetite. And that sometimes is accompanied by weight gain or weight loss that is not usually associated with dieting. There's also change in energy levels. So persons might find that they have suddenly feeling very lethargic, very tired, increased levels of fatigue. And with the level of activity that they're accustomed doing, it's hard to get out of bed sometimes. Depression also comes with a loss in purposeful activity. So along the lines of losing interest in activities, you find that persons become very slowed at what they're doing. It's a term that we call clinically psychomotor retardation, where your motor activities, your body movements become more slowed. You may become very slurred in your movements. And there's also feelings of worthlessness and guilt. So unlike regular sadness, where you may just feel sad but it doesn't really affect your self-esteem, in depression, persons feel very worthless and that their self-esteem is significantly decreased. You also find that coming along with depression, persons have a lot of thoughts of death and suicide. So suicidal ideation is a critical, significant sign of depression. And also persons have a lot of difficulty thinking and concentrating on focusing on one thing at a time. So the thing about depression is that you don't have to have all of those symptoms all together. You can have at least 5 or more of those symptoms, and they occur more days than not. It persists for about 2 weeks consistently, and at least one of those symptoms include the depressed mood or the loss of interest in activities that you would usually engage in. And more importantly, it is impairing your functioning in your daily life. So that you may have these symptoms, but it continues to affect you socially, at work, in your family, in your day-to-day life. It's preventing you from doing what you would usually do.
Is this linked to anxiety, some of the signs and symptoms?
So some of the signs and symptoms also co-occur in anxiety disorders, And in fact, one variation of depression is that you might have a major depressive episode with anxious distress, right? So there are a lot of similar symptoms in anxiety as well. Anxiety being a mental illness as well, as characterized by excessive worry and fear and feelings of being overwhelmed. It also, just like depression, includes difficulty focusing and sustaining your attention because you're so worried about things. Often the source of anxiety is unknown. In some cases, there's a generalized worry about things. And the thing about anxiety is that you might have a lot of physiological symptoms. So persons experience dizziness, nausea, sweaty palms, chest palpitations, and they may not attribute that to anxiety. They may feel that something is happening to them physically, and they may go to the doctor for that. So anxiety, like depression, has a lot of physiological symptoms as well, but overarching all of that is the constant sense of worry and anxiety and fear of something. Like depression as well, anxiety impairs your functioning in social settings, in your family, at work, at school if you're a student. Usually the symptoms persist and they exist more days than not. And then there are different types of depression and different types of anxiety as well.
Okay. So this is more than just, you have an exam to study for, you have a presentation to do. This is just constant, continuous worry and fear of the unknown.
Yes, and there are different, as I mentioned, there are different types of anxiety. So, for example, there's generalized anxiety disorder, where it's not specific to a situation like exams or presentation, or so you have a generalized sense of worry and anxiety about any situation, and it may not be specific to a situation. Then there's anxiety where it may be linked to specific phobias. So some persons have a fear of an animal, right? So persons are often afraid of snakes or spiders, right? That's a specific phobia. Or you may have a fear of a specific space. So some persons are afraid of being in enclosed spaces or going out into open spaces. Those are specific phobias. Then there's panic disorder or panic attacks, where persons feel an intense sense of fear and anxiety suddenly over a situation. That's very different from your regular anxiety
disorder.
And similarly, just with depression, that's very different from your grief response or just feelings of sadness. Because whereas those tend to be interspersed in waves, right? You may feel sad at some times, but then other times you feel a little bit better. With depression, you consistently feel in a low mood.
Okay, so tell me about how do I self-evaluate to determine if I'm suffering from depression or anxiety?
Okay, so it's funny that you asked that, because actually we ought not to self-evaluate, right? A first step is that you would look at yourself measured against the symptoms to see whether you are experiencing any of those symptoms. And of course, that's important for you to be able to identify that something is not right. But I always caution against self-evaluation, because then we all become doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists, and we start to panic when we're going through the checklist and realizing that we're probably meeting a lot of the criteria. So what that might cause is a little bit of panic and worry, and suddenly you start to self-diagnose, and you might take certain courses of action. So while you can certainly measure yourself against the symptoms, there's some brief inventories and so online that you can do and check out and see. Really and truly, you ought to be evaluated by a professional.
Vandana, is the medication available at the pharmacies/hospitals?
There are some medications which are available in the public sector, and then there are also medications which are available which persons would have to purchase privately. But it's important to know that mental illness is not only treated with medication. It's a hand-in-hand process, both in terms of the medication as well as psychotherapy.
Okay. What is covered by the CDAP? And when I mean CDAP, the CDAP is the Chronic Disease Assistance Program, which provides citizens with free prescription drugs and other pharmaceutical items. Are most of the drugs covered under CDAP with respect to anxiety and depression?
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not sure exactly which medications are covered. But my information is that some of them are there, whether the drugs that are on the market and available through the CEDAR program are completely effective. I'm not sure. But I do know that some of the drugs are available on the CEDAR program.
Okay. How can the less fortunate who can't afford the best medical care in Trinidad rise above these illnesses?
Okay, so that's a good question because accessibility to mental health services, any services actually,
Exactly.
is an issue for persons who cannot afford these services. So as I mentioned earlier, there are several options in the public sector. Under each RHA, Regional Health Authority, there are mental health clinics on different days. So persons can go to these facilities, inquire at the various health centers which clinics offer psychiatric services on what days. And there are psychiatrists, psychiatric social workers, mental health officers who can go. There are also a couple of NGOs that offer counseling services. So, for example, Families in Action, they offer counseling services. There's National Family Services Division, which is a public service agency that offers counseling for adults and children as well. There's also the child guidance clinics around the country. There are two, one in Port of Spain and one in San Fernando. That's a psychiatric clinic for children. And a child is anybody under the age of 18. So those are some options, and there are also a couple of hotlines in this country that are available for persons to reach out to should they need someone to speak to. So there's 800 SAVE, which is
and this is a 24-hour hotline.
Yes, this is a domestic violence hotline that persons who are the victims of domestic violence can reach out to. And I'm saying that although it's a domestic violence hotline, sometimes a lot of victims of domestic violence suffer from depression, suffer from anxiety because of what they're going through. So there's the 800 SAVE option for persons to reach out to. There's also Lifeline. Lifeline is a hotline that offers counseling for persons who may be suicidal, for persons who are depressed. There's also the Children's Authority has a hotline that's 996 or 800 2014, right? For cases where there are child protection concerns and where victims, for example, with child protection concerns may have certain mental concerns, depression, anxiety as well. And there's Childline. Childline is a hotline that their number is 800-4321. And Childline also offers services for children to call in, and they are helpers, they are listeners, where they can listen to the concerns and offer some counseling as well.
Okay. Tell me about the stigma in Trinidad. How can we work towards making it something that more people should talk about? When I mean more people, I mean younger people, because let's face it, the economic climate, the political climate, a lot of people suffer with a lot of ills in society. How can we ensure that they open up about how they feel?
Mental health stigma is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago, nor the Caribbean. It's actually a global phenomenon that countries all over the world are dealing with. And it's a sad reality, because once there is stigma, then persons become afraid or nervous to seek out help because of perceptions that persons might have of them. In terms of addressing stigma, I think we need to understand where does stigma come from, right? Stigma, mental health stigma, really stems from, beliefs about what mentally ill patients are like. That's fueled by a lot of fear. They see them as dangerous. They see them as violent. And there's also a lot of early beliefs which continue to be perpetuated about mental illness. If you see someone with mental illness, that there's superstitious origins as well. And even within our own Islamic community, there is belief that persons who exhibit some of the strange behaviors associated with mental illness, that it may be caused by demon possession and jinns and so, right? The media also portrays mental illness in a particular light. So, for example, when you see a schizophrenic patient, when you see schizophrenia on TV, what you see is a stark, raving, mad person. You know, recently there was a movie in cinema which, a very, very interesting movie which depicted someone with dissociative identity disorder, so multiple personalities, right? And that individual, the actor, did a fantastic job at showing, you know, what these different personalities look like. But all of these things contribute to a perception in the public's mind. And unfortunately, what is portrayed and what is often seen is the extreme range of mental illness.
Lifetime actually has a lot of movies like that.
Yes, and so you see a lot of the severe forms of psychopathology, right? You see the psychopaths and the sociopaths. And it's a misnomer, because mental illness isn't just extreme. I started by saying that there's mild to severe. So it's important, one, to understand that stigma, it stems from what we see and what we learn. But it's important to understand really what is mental illness.
Now that we talk about the social and the macro, let's talk a little bit about the religious aspects. How does Islam help mitigate the risks of mental illness?
Well, that's a great question, Leah. I mean, we have a beautiful religion that is a religion of perfection, and it offers solutions for every social ill, every problem that we face, and mental illness is no different. One of the things is that Islam is a religion of peace, and it espouses tenets of brotherhood and compassion and community. And those are the very tenets, when we think about brotherhood and compassion, that we need to look towards our social circle for support. So that's one way, right? Islam encourages brotherhood and seeking out the support and helping out, alleviating the suffering of your brother or your sister. Islam also espouses tenets of kindness and managing your anger and maintaining a sense of calm and peace. Those are all traits, personality traits, that help in resisting stress tolerance, stress, and being able to deal with some of the things that may trigger off mental illness. Salah, one of the very, very important aspects of Islam, using prayer as a coping tool for dealing with any problems that we may have. Knowing that you can, during your Salah, pour out your heart to Allah, and ask for assistance to deal with any problem that you may be facing, is another important resource that persons can use. Islam offers us that. Zikr, that's a form of recitation and a form of meditation, because you are in close remembrance of Allah, and feeling that sense of closeness with Allah helps us to be able to cope, knowing that He is there with us and He can get us through any experience. Also knowing that Allah is in charge. He is in charge. So anything that He puts us through, He will never give us anything that is disproportionate from what we can cope with. And there is a verse in Al-Quran, chapter 94, verses 5 to 6, which says that, "So verily with every difficulty there is relief." So in Islam we are taught to have hope, that if we are going through any difficulty, that Allah is going to help us. He's going to bring relief to us. Belief that Allah is in charge of everything, that He's all-knowing, He's all-wise, He's fair, right? Those things help us to counter a sense of hopelessness and a sense of feeling overwhelmed. There's another verse in chapter 65 that says, "And for those who fear Allah, He always prepares a way out, and He provides for him from sources that he could never imagine. And if anyone puts his trust in Allah, sufficient is Allah for him. For Allah will surely accomplish His purpose. Verily, for all things has Allah appointed a due proportion." So we see examples in Al-Quran where there's hope, there's relief, and we can trust in Allah to help us through our problems. There's also, we are, as Muslims, follow the sunnah of our Rasul, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he gave many examples where I spoke earlier about restructuring our thoughts and avoiding negative thoughts and replacing these with positive thoughts. And there's one example where he is quoted as saying, "Pay attention to that which can benefit you, and seek the help of Allah, and do not feel incapacitated. If anything befalls you, do not say, 'If only I had done such and such a thing would have happened.' Say instead, 'It is the decree of Allah, and what He wills He does.' For saying 'if only' opens the way for shaitan." Now, anxiety is often characterized by racing thoughts of, if this had happened, and if I had done this, and if only so and so had happened, I would have done so and so. And there's a lot of worrying about the unknown, and that brings a lot of fear and anxiety. But here we have an example of a prophet, peace be upon him, telling us, do not worry about if so and so. Trust that this is Allah's will, and that He will provide for us. So Islam makes a lot of room for mitigating the risks. Of course, Allah has given us willpower, and so in as much as we can pray and we can trust in Him to help us through the experiences, we also have a responsibility to do our own part in seeking out help as well. Making dua is important, but also reaching out to the professionals for the necessary assistance to help you through an experience a mental health concern is important.
Right. I think within the Muslim community, there are other problems that we may want to consider. As you stated earlier, many still choose not to seek treatment or quit prematurely, citing and believing it to be a spiritual problem. Many are worried about the stigma where Muslims feel as if they are ostracized once the information goes public. This applies even if they use other Muslims within that same community as psychologists. They also feel as if within the Muslim community there is little confidentiality of their own information, and so there is no way they can turn to even if they wanted to do so. What advice do you have for those persons?
It is a problem in the Muslim community. It's a problem in all communities, actually. But what I can say, what I always say to persons is that regardless of what you think may be the source, regardless of the stigma, it's important to know that seeking help is not a sign of weakness. Seeking help is actually a sign of a strength, because it means that you recognize that you are infallible, you are not perfect, and that you're self-aware to know that you can't deal with this on your own, and that you're reaching out for help to help you cope. When you have a heart condition, or when you have cancer, don't you seek help?
Yes, you do.
You do. You wouldn't sit there and deal with it on your own and get more ill, right? You want to be there for your family. You want to experience all of the rest of your life that is ahead of you. It's the same with mental illness. It's just a different type of illness. So seeking help is important to recognize as not a sign of weakness, right? We have examples in Islam where our Prophet, peace be upon him, sought help when he had problems as well. He relied upon the companions. He relied upon his wife for advice and for counsel. He did not, and he was perfect, and he had Allah with him all along, and he could have dealt with any problem that he faced. But he also sought help. So who are we to seek help? And it is just an example of, it's just understanding that this is not an impossible situation. We can seek help, and we are aware and we recognize that we can't do it alone.
Okay. Would you like to touch on other mental illnesses that are common to Trinidad?
Sure. Mental illness in Trinidad and by the region by extension is quite common. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, we don't have the full statistics to support it. But the World Health Organization did do a study, as I mentioned, in 2011, and it found that the most common mental illnesses in the Caribbean are schizophrenia, substance use disorders, personality disorders, and mood disorders. And mood disorders include depression and so. So those are the common ones in the Caribbean and in Trinidad as well. And particularly with children, we tend to see a lot of ADHD. That's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We see some developmental disorders. So you'll see quite a number of children with autism, and they're on the spectrum of autism spectrum disorders, and we see quite frequently children with conduct disorders. So those are some of the common ones in the Caribbean.
What is the average waiting time for treatments at the hospital that you're willing to disclose?
Well, I don't work in the hospital setting. So what I'm aware of is that I know that if persons have an imminent need, if there is an emergency as it relates to mental health, those things are dealt with immediately. As I mentioned, there are inpatient facilities and ambulance services that can provide those services. Certainly, if persons are homicidal or suicidal, those things are dealt with very expeditiously in the hospital settings. Outpatient clinics, I know, are held, I think, either every week or every other week at the various clinics there are. So persons can access these services fairly regularly. In terms of follow-up health services, if persons are getting these in the outpatient clinic, there are regular follow-ups on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, depending on the need, depending on the severity of the illness as well.
Finally, tell me about demographics. In Trinidad, as you know, we are mostly comprised of the Indian community and the African community. Now, I mean, all of us aren't blind to see that most people, some of the demographics, they tend to be centered around a certain age group. When you go into Port of Spain and environs and you see people who are suffering with mental illness, how does it affect ethnic groups? Or is it limited to more than one ethnic group, or is it across the board?
It's difficult to make a statement on that in the absence of data to really support which ethnic groups are more affected or less affected than the other. And it's important to also know that, as I mentioned earlier, there are no exemptions, right? It does affect persons of all ethnicities and all other demographic categories. What I think is more important is that whether it affects ethnicities in whatever way, there may be some other social and sociological factors at play. In terms of whether some ethnicities may have more of an individualistic approach as opposed to a more collectivistic approach, right? Meaning that one group may treat with issues more privately, another group may treat with issues more from a community perspective, so that there may be more social support maybe available to be able to deal with the issue, as opposed to another group may not have that level of community and community support and family support. Help-seeking behavior is quite interlinked with that as well. So that if certain groups offer more social support and more options for treatment, then there may be more openness to seeking help, right, as opposed to another. So these are some of the factors that may influence, whether how you see persons being affected. But really and truly, in the absence of the data, it's hard to make those statements.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank Vandana for taking the time out of today. I would also like to congratulate her in terms of how informative this discussion was. To summarize, anxiety and depression is more common than you think, and don't be afraid to reach out to the following contact information, which will be displayed on the screen thereafter. I want to thank everyone for listening and joining us today, and I'd also like to especially thank our guest Vandana for providing more feedback on this. Hi guys, we as Muslims, we suffer from mental illness as well, just like everyone else. Here are 5 tips we can do to make it better. 1.
Seek help through patience and prayer.
2.
Trust in Allah because He will test you. So know that if He puts you to it, He will bring you through it.
3.
Engage in zikr. Constant remembrance of Allah will bring us closer to Him.
4.
Avoid the if-onlys and thinking over and over about what could have been done.
5.
Cultivate a sense of brotherhood and support, and help out your brother or your sister who may be mentally ill, and be compassionate.
Thank you guys for joining us here today. We do hope this presentation was beneficial. We do hope you learned from it. please don't be afraid to reach out if you feel you are suffering with a mental illness, because it affects everyone. Should you require more information, we will have contact information that will be displayed after the video. Thank you. Goodbye. Assalamu alaikum.
مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم. مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم. محمد سيد الكونين والثقلين، محمد سيد الكونين والثقلين.